So obviously, so this is Theranos, the most evil business in the world, with Elizabeth Holmes, and we will be watching this video and then seeing what it's about, and then I'm going to give my perspective throughout the video.
First they think you're crazy, then they fight you, and then all of a sudden you change the world.
What do you want to be when you're older? Doctor, teacher, musician? Nope. When 9-year-old Elizabeth Holmes was asked this question, she immediately said, I want to be a billionaire. And she's...
Right, that's everybody wants to be a billionaire, man. Everybody wants to be a billionaire. That's funny. Shit. I mean...
Succeeded. Elizabeth would become the youngest self-made female billionaire after starting a company called Theranos that claimed it was going to revolutionize healthcare and change the world. The company became worth around $9 billion, and Elizabeth was on the cover of magazines being hailed as the next Steve Jobs. The only problem is it was all a lie. This is the story of why and how Elizabeth...
So my question is how many businesses that are value at $9 billion or $1 billion. I mean, how many of those other businesses that, you know, we're told that are value at those amounts that are not? That's my question. You know, that gives you a good sense of finance, and you know, and a lot of finance is just fluff. A lot of finance is nothing but just fluff.
Elizabeth Holmes scammed her way to the top, and how it all came crashing down.
Can you tell us a secret? I don't have many secrets.
At the age of just 19, Elizabeth Holmes dropped out of Stanford University to start her own business. It was originally called Real-Time Cures, but Elizabeth changed the name after worrying people would be skeptical of the word cures, and she certainly didn't want to attract any suspicion. So she instead renamed it Theranos, a combination of the words therapy and diagnosis. Elizabeth had a phobia of needles, and had a vision where you could simply prick your finger and with a single drop of blood test for hundreds of different diseases. Since Elizabeth came from a well-connected family, she was able to raise some initial money to get the company up and running to pursue this idea. She was also a very persuasive saleswoman, and investors were drawn in by her vision and confidence.
So Elizabeth Holmes was a very good salesperson. So obviously that tells you that sales is very important, and how you appear to other people is very important too. Even if it is a scam, you know. Vision and confidence, right?
What was noticeable, though, is that people who invested did not have medical backgrounds. In fact, some of the experts in this field that she spoke to specifically warned her that her idea most likely wasn't even possible. But Elizabeth ignored those warnings, and began hiring a team of scientists to help her. Unsurprisingly, progress on this revolutionary new blood testing device was a lot slower than she'd hoped. So she demanded that research start happening 24/7, meaning some employees would have to start working through the night. The lab manager thought this was a bad idea, as they were already so overworked. So Elizabeth hired a second team and pitted them against each other. The team that made the least progress would be fired. By 2006, the engineers...
So that's bad practice right there, right? That's bad leadership off the rip, right? Overworking your employees. Leadership doesn't really have an idea of like what they're actually creating, right? She's just the visionary, but she doesn't really know what has to be done to get that product created. So, you know, putting people against each other, toxic environment, this is not good.
Who created a prototype machine called the Edison. Here's how it worked. You put a drop of blood on a small cartridge and slide it into the machine, which runs the test. The data is then wirelessly transmitted via the internet to a lab, where it's analysed and then a report is sent back. Basically, the machine would make blood tests much faster, cheaper, easier, and all from a portable device you could use in the comfort of your own home. At least, that's what the machine claimed to do, but it very rarely worked, and had an extremely high error rate. It was clear to everyone working on the machine that it needed a lot more work before it was ready.
When I was there, we could not complete any test accurately on the devices that we were manufacturing.
The problem was that by this point,
So, like, what they didn't tell you, I haven't looked at it, or I didn't hear anything about how many scientists actually quit this organization after working there after a few months. I don't know, but I kind of feel like you're working towards something that you're not really seeing consistent results over a certain period of time. I mean, there's no way that I would have stayed.
Theranos had burnt through its initial funding, and they needed more money fast. So, Elizabeth began sweet-talking more investors, bragging about this revolutionary new machine they'd created, and claiming that it worked perfectly. When investors asked to come see the machine in action, Elizabeth created an elaborate deception, so they didn't realize how faulty the machine was.
They would get their finger pricked with a small amount of blood, then they'd be let out of the room, they'd go have a meeting, go have lunch, whatever, and at which point an engineer would run in the room, grab the cartridge, and bring it out to the lab.
So was the Edison doing the testing?
No, absolutely not.
Who was doing the testing?
It was scientists at the bench.
When the investors returned to the lab to see their results, they just assumed the machine had worked perfectly. But the test hadn't even been done using the machine. The demonstration was all a sham. But the investors were fooled. Many of them were rich older men who seemed especially taken in by Elizabeth. When the company's financial officer found out about this, he told Elizabeth they had to stop doing fake demonstrations.
Oh, definitely. Most definitely. A finance professional would have definitely caught on to it, because you're not making any organic sales, man. There's no revenue coming in outside of just investments, right? Investors are the only people that are putting money in your business. Is not going to look good, right? You have zero sales and nothing but expenses. So definitely a CFO would have said something.
Because it was misleading investors to think the machine worked much better than it really did. And not just that, Elizabeth had also been asking him to significantly increase the revenue predictions, to make the company's finances look much better than they really were. When the financial officer confronted Elizabeth about all this, her expression immediately turned ice cold, and she told him he should leave right now. And she didn't mean leave her office, she meant leave the company. For daring to push back against what she was doing, he was fired. And to make things even worse, Elizabeth never hired another CFO to replace him, meaning there was nobody to question the absurd revenue predictions she was giving to investors, so she could easily make up whatever numbers she wanted. And it worked. Theranos raised yet more millions of dollars in funding. However, the chief financial officer was just one of many in a long line of employees to get fired from the company. For example, when Elizabeth decided to start doing
I mean, most people know that, but when you start seeing like leadership, especially executive leadership, leave or they get fired, then obviously something's not right.
Trial of the Edison machine on a group of terminal cancer patients, several employees came to her to tell her she shouldn't be doing this, since the machine was constantly breaking and giving wildly inaccurate results. And they said it wasn't fair to use real patients as guinea pigs. But she continued with the trial anyway, and anyone who spoke out against her in any way was fired. When someone questioned her, she took it as disloyalty, and would stare at them without blinking until they broke the silence. Because of this culture...
So Elizabeth Holmes she's a psychopath. She's a psychopath. She's probably very difficult to deal with, and she's just she was living in her own head, and it didn't match reality. So that's always can be kind of difficult working for those types of people. So.
For firing anyone who raised concerns, staff turnover was ridiculously high, and Elizabeth ended up being surrounded by yes men who had blind loyalty to her, or people...
Oh man, that's always a tough one. Blind loyalty. It's not good.
Who were simply too terrified to speak up. For example, the company hired quite a few workers from overseas who had a working visa, and would have to leave the country if they got fired, so they didn't speak up about their concerns. It actually wasn't Elizabeth who did most of the firing though. Instead, it was the number 2 in command at the company, a man named Sunny Balwani. He'd come from a software background, so knew very little about medicine, and would often randomly repeat...
I don't know why in these documentaries they keep trying to compare Elizabeth Holmes to Steve Jobs. She wanted to be like Steve Jobs, creating iPhones is a lot different than performing them performing like medical experiments on patients. It's a lot different. It's a big difference. The risk is a lot higher in the medical profession than it is selling iPhones. So
technical terms he overheard to make it sound like he knew what was going on. The reason he was second in command was because him and Elizabeth were in a relationship. But this was yet another secret. In fact, Elizabeth outright lied to the board about this, since she knew that hiring her partner for the second in command role was a clear conflict of interests. Sunny had met Elizabeth when she was just 18 years old, and he was 37, and they'd been dating ever since. However, Sunny was described by employees as a tyrant. He was brutal, aggressive, and intimidating to employees. He watched everyone on CCTV to check how...
So that guy got sentenced to prison also for fraud and a bunch of other felonies that he committed at this organization. But obviously you shouldn't be dating the person that is helping you run an organization. So yeah, that was a bad idea.
How long they were working, and angrily shouted at them if they weren't working lots of overtime. When he found out one employee who had a family was only working the minimum of 8 hours a day, he told him he'd fix him. He made several employees cry with his interrogations and abuse. He tracked everything they did, looking through their browsing history, and even installing a keylogger on their computers to track every word they typed, including the company's receptionist. This was all part of the company's insanely secretive culture. Employees all had to sign non-disclosure agreements when they joined. In fact, anyone who even entered the Theranos building had to sign one, and would be accompanied at all times by security guards, even to the bathroom. Employees also weren't meant to mention Theranos on their LinkedIn bio, or even talk to their families about what they did.
I mean, a secretive culture, that's not a problem. I mean, a lot of organizations are like that, you know, like, a lot of organizations are like that. I mean, especially if you're in the accounting department or if you're whatever, it's not much of a problem.
Theranos had even blocked the chat feature on the company's computers, so you couldn't message co-workers on other teams, meaning the company was very siloed off and divided. This was extremely impractical, because it meant the chemistry team and the engineering team weren't in communication, which massively slowed research down. Theranos constantly claimed that this secrecy was simply to protect trade secrets. But in reality, it was to cover up all the lies about the state of their technology and the way the company was being run. And when anyone was fired, or if they quit, which also happened very frequently, they were forced to sign yet another non-disclosure agreement confirming they wouldn't talk about anything at all that had happened whilst at Theranos. They couldn't even speak to any of their colleagues on their way out, they had to leave immediately. Theranos had hired one of the top law firms and threatened to sue anyone who mentioned anything about what they'd seen at the company. Most people were just relieved to get out of there, so they reluctantly signed whatever they wanted to avoid more legal threats. As a precaution, Sunny would also ask the head of IT to dig up dirt on employees that could be used as leverage against them in future if they ever spoke out. There was one incident where an employee refused to sign an NDA when he quit though, and Sunny called the cops on him, claiming he'd taken company property. But when the police arrived to ask what he'd actually stolen, Sunny blurted out, he stole property, in his mind. So to summarise, it was an anxious, paranoid work environment. And yet, despite that, many in the company believed they truly were working towards something revolutionary. Elizabeth constantly reminded employees how impactful their technology would be in making tests more accessible to everyone. It would help detect a variety of diseases, including cancer, and thus saving lives. There was a strong driving mission, and Elizabeth had them all convinced they were going to change the world.
You want it to be true so badly. I was working with these devices every single day, and she could still kind of convince me.
And so, whilst many employees did...
So yeah, that Schultz guy, that's the whistleblower who actually told on Elizabeth Holmes. So that's a smart guy. So he knew something was up. So he dropped a dime on her. In other words,
have concerns that the device they'd created still wasn't working the way Elizabeth claimed it did. Obviously, Theranos wouldn't actually start letting the general public use these machines until they were properly working. Right? But before that, I want to tell you about today's video sponsor, PureVPN. If you're browsing the internet without a VPN, your real IP address is visible, meaning sites you visit can see your location. Whereas with PureVPN, they have a strict no-logs policy, so you can browse online safely and anonymously. They also have thousands of servers across 78 different countries, meaning you can change your location, bypass geo-restrictions, and unblock all major streaming services like Netflix. PureVPN is quick and easy to use and has apps across all major platforms. So get started today by using the link in the description below and you'll get a huge discount off your order. Just use the code MAGNATESMedia. After you've done that, let's get to the next chapter.
For just $67, you can make as many videos as you want, and you never need to pick up a camera or use any fancy editing software.
In 2013, Theranos announced a partnership with Walgreens and Safeway, where they would start offering Theranos blood tests in their stores. For the first time, the general public was going to be able to use Theranos' machine. Elizabeth seemed to expect the machines would be fully working by the time they launched in stores, but they weren't. They were still breaking and producing inaccurate results. Did this stop Elizabeth from going ahead? Absolutely not. Walgreens and Safeway...
I mean, so obviously that was a big problem, right? The product didn't work, right? I think that she could have actually made this happen. I think Matthew Cox, he said this in one of his videos. She could have actually made this work if she would have scaled back on the amount of diseases that a drop of blood could have caused. She would have said a few diseases, not 150 different diseases. She could have possibly made this work. Over time, they could have made the product better and better and better. But that's just not what happened. She just rushed. She rushed the product. Didn't work. This is not good leadership.
Safeway were putting up a lot of money for this deal, a lot of which Theranos had already spent. Plus, by rolling out their machines in stores, it helped Elizabeth to raise around $400 million more from investors, who are now even more convinced that everything with the company seemed to be going great. Their logic was that there's no way Theranos would be rolling out blood tests in stores unless their technology worked just as well as they said it did. So wealthy investors threw yet more money in without asking too many questions, because they didn't want to miss out on investing in such a seemingly revolutionary company. And
so, apparently some of the quote unquote like the most esteemed private equity firms are pretty much like esteemed people who came from reputable backgrounds put a lot of money in this company. So you know, when you invest money in a company, you're not guaranteed a return. And I mean, the company fails, you lose all your money. So that's why, like, you know, like maybe an audit, maybe operational audit, maybe, you know, a few other measures that they could have taken that they didn't take before they started investing a lot of money into this organization. That definitely would help.
Because many of these investors were high-profile names, like Rupert Murdoch and the Walton family, it gave Theranos even more credibility. Now, the idea with this deal with Walgreens and Safeway was they'd set up Theranos booths in their store where people could get a blood test done with just a prick of their finger, and essentially choose from a menu of which things they wanted to test for. However, this had meant to begin in 2011, but because the machines didn't actually work properly yet, Elizabeth kept trying to stall for time. There was excuse after excuse to delay the launch date, often for completely bizarre reasons, like she once said that they were behind schedule because of an earthquake in Japan, even though that had absolutely no impact on their business. But anyway.
Man, people bought that. I mean, obviously she was lying, man. She was stalling time. I mean, sometimes a lot of I mean, we don't know, but I can only imagine a lot of business leaders, they do that. But again, you're not selling iPhones, you're not selling shoes. I mean, you're doing medical examinations on patients. It's a different level of risk that, you know, clearly these quote-unquote investors didn't take into consideration.
After almost 2 years of delays, eventually Elizabeth couldn't stall any longer, and she had to make a decision: admit the technology didn't work and lose the deal with Walgreens and Safeway, which would mean refunding many millions of dollars, or just put the faulty machines in stores and hope it somehow all works out. This was a turning point. Up until now, Elizabeth had deceived investors, but now by letting the general public use these faulty Theranos machines, she was literally putting lives at risk. If someone got a blood test done on a Theranos machine and it gave the wrong results, it could be fatal. They can either be diagnosed with something they don't have, or think their results are fine, but really, they have a serious issue. But Elizabeth pressed on anyway, and Walgreens and Safeway started offering Theranos blood tests in their stores. Of course, because the machines weren't working properly, Theranos couldn't get approval from regulators for in-store testing. So as a workaround, instead of actually doing the blood test in store, like Elizabeth had promised Walgreens and Safeway they would do, Theranos instead simply collected the blood in store and physically sent it off to a nearby lab they'd set up. This loophole meant they didn't need to go through the same regulatory checks. But not just that, one of the biggest selling points of Theranos was meant to be that you only needed a small drop of blood from a finger prick. But when people actually arrived to get their blood tested, they often had their blood taken with a syringe the traditional way. And whereas the results were supposed to be ready in just a few hours, instead the results often took weeks. Basically, the whole thing was advertised as some revolutionary experience, yet it seemed just like a normal blood test. And the reason for that is it was just a normal blood test. In order to give the perception everything was going fine, Theranos were taking normal blood samples and using third-party machines from other companies to do most of the blood tests. But because they were shipping the blood off to a private lab, people didn't realize Theranos were hardly even using their own technology. Theranos had promised their machine could perform 192 different tests, but in reality, it could only perform 12. In fact, it was later discovered that over half of the tests they promised weren't even theoretically possible. And of the 12 things their machine could test for, most didn't work very well. So, Theranos was performing tests on third-party machines and pretending it was their own results. And because of Elizabeth's insistence on using a small amount of blood, they had to dilute the blood samples to be able to run them on the commercial testing machines, which reduced the accuracy of the results. But it gets much worse. The lab Theranos had set up near the stores to process the blood samples had been very hastily put together, and many of the staff they'd hired were very inexperienced. The people who were more experienced tended to quit or get fired for criticizing the way things were done. For example, when one lab director quit over concerns that blood samples weren't being handled properly, they were replaced with a dermatologist. One of the biggest problems was that in order to send the blood samples from the stores to the lab, Theranos was simply using FedEx, and this meant parcels often overheated, causing the blood to clot. So not only were Theranos completely lying about how they were doing it.
Man, this is crazy, but this shows you that how Elizabeth Holmes, man, I mean, that's why she got a lot of time in prison, because, you know, she made a lot of people look stupid. And one thing I can tell you, people don't want to look stupid.
These tests, they weren't even doing the test properly. Very soon, people started noticing abnormal test results. For example, one young healthy person got results back implying he had cancer. But when he went and got the blood test repeated by his actual doctor, his results were perfectly fine. Elizabeth was literally putting patients' lives at risk by sending out incorrect results. And yet they pressed on in order to keep up the pretense that everything was working fine. Theranos was now live in stores in Arizona, with plans to roll out all across America soon, and then the entire world. And yet, whilst internally in the Theranos labs there was chaos, externally, Elizabeth was securing yet more funding from investors and starting to gain publicity and fame. In 2014, Forbes named her.
I mean, obviously, from a business perspective, and just organizational perspective, a lot of things were going wrong that, I mean, they did a good job at hiding a lot of stuff. I mean, at the end of the day, I feel like she could have definitely pulled this off if she would have scaled back on, you know, on the product and the delivery of what she told investors that it could do. It could have worked, but obviously she didn't have the wisdom to tell the truth. I mean, I think if she would have told the truth, it would have been a different ending.
Elizabeth Holmes, the world's youngest self-made female billionaire, worth $4.5 billion.
So that valuation is bullshit, right? That valuation is just other people investing. Other organizations and other high-profile individuals are giving her money, right, or giving her cash, and that's pretty much her valuation. It's just outside funding, right? It's not necessarily a lot of that isn't from organic sales and organic partnerships and organic business development. So that valuation is just full of shit, especially if you don't have a product or a service that's functional and working.
Because she owned around half of Theranos shares, which was now being valued at $9 billion. Which raises a very simple question. How the hell was she getting away with this?
Yeah, so this was definitely a good little my first business case study. I'm putting on, I'm putting this on my YouTube channel. So this was a good little case study that I liked, because this was everything that could have went wrong with this organization went wrong, from leadership to the bottom, and my integrity and character is the most important thing a person in an organization can have outside of just generating dollars.